This is Karina, and you're listening to Bold, Brown and British, a weekly podcast where we discuss what it means to be a brown person in a Western world. We've spoken about colorism, third culture identity, and dating, amongst many others in this podcast. So if this sounds like the type of content that you want to hear, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also message us on Instagram. The handle is @BoldBrownAndBritish, or drop us an email via our website at www.boldbrownbritish.com. So without further ado, let's get on with this week's episode. Hey, how's it going?
I mean, things could be better. Isn't that the whole theme of this one?
I know. Well, I know it's funny because I almost put off recording this podcast for the very reason that the podcast is about, the theme. So as an introduction, what I'd love to talk about is burnout, and more specifically workplace burnout. Like I was kind of Googling it because I wanted to have either a definitive, I guess, definition of what it is, but also to figure out, is this actually something that's diagnosed? What exactly is it? So the definition we came across is job burnout or work. It's basically a type of work-related stress, and it's a state of physical, emotional exhaustion, which involves a state of reduced accomplishment and sometimes loss of personal identity. It's not a medical diagnosis. However, it is an accumulation of other conditions or can be caused by other mental or physical conditions. And everyone, firstly, if you are one of those people that are experiencing burnout, I think it's important to say everybody has experienced burnout at least once in their career. And if you haven't, it's probably something not so fun that you have to look forward to. It's just one of those things. I think the thing that I had to kind of come to terms with is that it's not related to work ethic, and it's not necessarily your fault all the time.
No, I definitely think that's true because in my previous job, I literally got to a fork in the road where I've been working really late hours, so it's almost that physical exhaustion and so what. But and even when I handed in my notice, I decided that yes, I am physically burnt out and also just mentally checked out. But I didn't stop working. Even to my very last day, I was still putting in the hours, things that need to be done. And again, I spent so much extra time doing a handover and everything else. So there was nothing to say oh, I wouldn't still do the work or anything else. But there's just times and again where you're just you've just checked out, or again, it's got to such a bad point. And I kind of wish I would recognize the signs a lot earlier so I didn't have to get to the point of checkout. Burnout is a bit different to checked out. So I think something that you kind of need to navigate and try and cope with as well a lot better, because I think you get to a part where it gets to other consequences, and this is where you start thinking about leaving your job, or again, it's not for you, or anything else like that. So it's better to kind of keep it in check, or again find a coping mechanism to help you get through it, or again something you just overcome, and things are back to normal maybe for some people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you said is really interesting, because checking out is a symptom of burnout. However, not always, because there's a lot of reasons you can be checked out at work. It could be because of the environment. It could also be, unfortunately, it could be due to work ethics. Some people are just more checked out at work than others are. But burnout is very different, because I often found that the times I have burnt out, I didn't realize until it was way too late, until I was either the verge of burnout or I was in the midst of it, let alone at that point where I'm like, oh my God, I'm so burnt out. And I think the reason for that is because it's such an accumulation of really small things, which, unless you're checking in with yourself constantly, it can be easily missed, I think.
And again, sometimes like it's like factors out of your control. You can't really control how much work comes in. And again, like they always say like, oh, time management and things like that, but that like there's just not enough time in the day to be managing your time in order to not reach that physical exhaustion. And then other kind of pressures like deadlines and also like being able to deliver, not letting people down. And also, like if you have to be in the office physically, then that is another kind of like physical like aspect that counts into everything that all contributes towards everything else. And then let alone the kind of like stresses and pressures you'll have at work that everyone faces. So it's yeah, finding a way to like cope with it. But again, sometimes those things are so out of your control, and when you kind of push yourself way too far, you don't really realize it because you're trying to keep going, trying to meet these deadlines, trying to tick everything off the list and everything else, that you just don't realize how far you push yourself. And like by that point, I think your brain's run too far from your body to kind of notice that you've been burnt out.
Definitely. And I think that you're right. So, just listing off some of the mental and physical symptoms. So, I think the mental symptoms are often the ones that come later, but they're the kind of bigger, I guess, tick boxes to you noticing that, hang on, perhaps I'm heading towards a burnout. And, they can be your mood. So you have a lower or depressed mood. You can feel a little bit kind of, it starts off with kind of imposter syndrome, and it can goes into not feeling valued, not feeling a little bit worthless, in self-confidence, losing the interest of pleasure, doing the stuff that you normally would like, concentration issues, as you said, checking out at work. But because burnout is caused by chronic stress, I think it's really helpful to also be aware of how this stress affects our bodies physically. It can be felt physically in terms of having more aches and pains, and it can be lower energy levels, changes in appetite. You know, I've had I've heard people that have like something as high uh, something as significant as higher blood pressure, but also smaller things like you just have a slightly poorer immune system and you just get sick more often. You're having more headaches and you have slight issues with sleeping. And the thing with these physical symptoms is that alone and isolated, you wouldn't necessarily link them to a burnout. You would, for example, if you were having stomach problems, you could easily be like, oh, you know what, I've been eating really badly. That's probably why. Or if you're not getting sleep, you can be like, oh, it's probably because I've, had that coffee and I'm just wired. And that's why, like, it's very easy to excuse these physical symptoms because it's not burnout is not the only reason you would have them. It's only when you add them to the mental symptoms and you're like, hang on. But by the time the mental symptoms come, it's way over the line where you are 100% at the beginning of that burnout, if not further in.
Yeah, because we had some experts come in from Mind, and they were kind of like explaining that actually a lot of it is like a rubber band. Like you start penting up all these kind of things where like you're running at 100 miles, your body starts feeling it first. So when you start feeling like, oh, a couple of headaches, maybe it's migraines if you suffer from migraines, and things like that. Like it might not come at the exact time that, oh, you're feeling at your peak stress. And again, it's probably a bit late when you kind of notice those things, but like any kind of like, oh, back aches or shoulder aches where you're like, actually, nothing seems to be linking towards anything. It's usually the first signs that your body is telling you like you are like getting to this point of like exhaustion, and it's just penting up, and it's just your kind of body doing a warning sign saying like you need to look after yourself before like you get depleted.
Definitely. So I think let's take a bit of a step back, or rather, we're looking at this at the moment from the person who is burnt out, and we'll come back to then how to kind of cope with it and how you can manage that if you are feeling that. But I think there's also a lot to be said about what causes burnout, and thus what managers can do to kind of eliminate this, because I think so, for example, a lot of burnout can be, as you said, because of unreasonable time pressures, because there's just so much work to do, it's unreasonable time pressures and linked to an unmanageable workload, for example. And it can mean that people are just feeling a little bit hopeless and they're feeling overwhelmed. And like, for example, I think there's a stat that employees that say that they have enough time to do their work are 70% less likely to experience burnout versus individuals who don't, which are ridiculous. Like 70% is an insane number. And I think it's just something that's not really spoken about as much.
Yeah, and I'm sure like almost everyone sort of experiences where you just feel like, oh, there's not enough people to do the work, that there's not enough time in the day. And again, like whether you take clients or again, maybe your manager or your director or whoever's the boss of your company is just setting these like very short deadlines that it's not even enough physical time in the day. And again, you're like, as most people like kind of go, you don't work one thing at a time. You're working in like multiple projects in one go, so it's just like, oh, everything needs your attention, everything needs a certain amount of attention and hours dedicated to it, and there's just not enough time in the day, and you're kind of like 9 till 5 sort of thing to get it done. So then I think as well, actually we never really touched on like after COVID, we're working from home, so there's just no distinction between clocking on at 9 and then clocking off at 6, and then we're just never switching off. Probably you've got like
yes.
a work phone or work emails on your own like personal phone maybe, and keep check it on the weekends. You're not switching off as well. It's like, which really plays a big part into burnout, where you're just like not being able to separate work from your personal life and having that work-life balance.
Definitely. And especially when you're working from home, a lot of us were or are still working off our dining room tables, and you're or even working from the bedroom, depending on how much space you have. And it's so difficult because previously, where you go into the office, you go in and you'd physically leave, you're physically leaving the space. And I think there's a lot to be said about using your commute as a bit of a downtime, and then you'd go meet your friends, or you might do whatever after work, but that's your after work time, and there was that physical separation. But now there isn't really that, and there is that blur. I think it's very easy to bring quite literally your work home, and as you said, you're like, it's easy to be like, oh, I've not really got much to do. Oh, maybe I'll just log in to work, and maybe I'll just check my email. Maybe I'll just respond to this one thing. And before you know it becomes a habit, doesn't it? And it can
yeah yeah because actually I kind of never thought about this, but I remember a girl from my old work was saying that like she would actually make sure she'd fold down her desk, that she has her work laptop during the Corona times. And she said like, I have to physically fold that table down and shut my laptop and put it away, because otherwise I will be touching it. And then like going through like working through the evening, and then all of a sudden it's like, now it's bedtime. Like you've had no downtime, you haven't had time to unwind, you haven't had time to do anything for yourself, or even looked after yourself, to cook your dinner and things like that, which you realize is now becoming a luxury and things like that, because there's not enough time in the day.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that I mean, similarly to that, I previously, when COVID started, I had set up my work desk, with my like 2 screens and whatever in my bedroom. And I realized that I just wasn't getting enough sleep, because every time I'd imagine that dreaded ping of that email or of Teams, I would just kind of think, and I would just be alert the entire night. And I was like, no, I need a physical separation. And it wasn't, don't get me wrong, it wasn't necessarily far, because all it went is from my bedroom to the living room slash dining room. And if you know, like London spaces, it's barely a couple of steps away. But even that did so much. And I think there is something to be said about that physical distinction, but also going back to that role aspect. Sometimes it's just a lack of clarity in what your job actually is. And, I think I've certainly had it where I just didn't know what was expected of them, what things like they're moving targets and people are just exhausted, but trying to figure out what the hell am I meant to be doing? What does the business, the team, my manager, what do they actually want me to do? Like, what does success look like? And I think as a manager, it's really important to define what does success look like and be super clear about that, but also offer that communication and support, and almost like a like a I call it the psychological buffer of stress.
I think that makes sense because and again, like in one of my previous jobs, it's kind of that thing where it's like where the targets are always moving, you can just never hit it. So you're very unfulfilled in and you just don't get that sense of achievement. So you start getting to that negative mindset, being like, oh, what's the point? I'm never hitting these targets. I seem to be failing in all aspects of my objectives or goals, and I might not be getting a promotion, or again, people are thinking I'm not good at my job. I can't even tick the boxes, let alone be it hitting the higher goals and things like that. And then as well, I think it's quite important for managers to be able to kind of recognize that actually, yeah, your team does need guidance, even if it's literal, like I need to lay down the road plan to you, or be honest, if you don't know what the road plan is, you're probably that manager is getting the same thing from their bosses, being like, yeah, I don't know what they want, they keep moving the targets, they keep changing their mind and things like that. It's actually quite nice to have that transparent, honest conversation with your subordinates or your direct reports, and being like, not gonna lie, the CEO above me keeps changing his mind every day, so I can't set your targets, but I'll be honest with you, and again, you can be honest with me, and it's a two-way conversation. We'll navigate this together. But
I recently worked on a project that it was that there was just so many with this particular team, there was so many moving targets, so many things that kept changing, things that would be approved and then it would be like, nope, changed our mind very late, very last minute. And it was so frustrating. And initially I started by kind of covering it up, and then I was like, no, this is not going to work, because then my team are just going to get frustrated. And I found that what it actually came up as a bit of an accident, because I was just really frustrated, and I turned around to my team one day and I was like, you know what, I don't even know what the hell they want. But that level of open communication led to the team feeling a lot more supported, because they're like, you know what, it's not because we don't know what to do or we're not being told, it's because at least at the very least you feel that, yeah, I don't know what to do, and my manager doesn't know what to do, but it's not because she's not trying, and I know she's trying, or he is trying the best of their ability to figure it out. And as a result, you feel a lot more supported, because you're like, okay, at the very least, you can complain about it, right? Like, I found that I have my team that actually, whilst they complain a little bit more to me, but I'd much rather that, because them venting prevents that burnout, prevents them from being alienated from the job and the work related activities, that if it means that a 3 to 5 minute rant, or it means that, oh my god, I'm just really stressed, and if that means that it's going to become less stressful and frustrating and cause you to become a little less cynical about the working conditions and the people that you work with, then do that. Like, I 100% would say it's not worth the emotional exhaustion. Now, that is to say, like, I do have to say that I'm saying that from the perspective of somebody who has I've had the honor of working with a good manager, but I've also experienced burnout when I've not been, like, there is zero chance that I would have been able to go to my manager and say, hey, I'm feeling really overwhelmed, because it would be seen badly. It would be like, oh, then you can't do your job properly, or it would lead to unfair treatment, like favoritism, or mistreatment from or whatever. So those things already exist, and I don't want to sit here and say, like, oh, you can just talk to your manager and it'll all be okay, because how many times
you need to do that? Yeah, no, exactly. And it's horrible to say, sometimes you need to know who you can trust, and like the right thing to say, because again, not every manager is very understanding. And again, especially when it's tasks that they directly set you, then you don't want you don't want them to feel like you're attacking them, being like, yeah, you can't work out, like, have you not worked out that, like, this is physically impossible and you're driving me to the ground, sort of thing. But it does pay to say, like, yeah, as like, just having that honest conversation, saying like, oh, it's not you, it's the managers or the person above or the client can't figure their minds out or change their minds. That actually makes, like, the employee or your direct report feel so much better, that it's not personally them that, like, is incompetent or can't do the job. It's literally just something slightly beyond their control. And again, it's not like for them to feel bad about it or take it personally and be like, oh, I've just done such a crap job or everything else, or it wasn't good enough. And actually, like, you just being honest and saying, like, I'm not going to lie, I don't know what to suggest, because the client's changed their mind, just makes them feel a lot better. And as well, I think, and I appreciated this from one of my older managers, like, she would be in the same, like, say she'd be in the same boat, being like, no, like, I've actually been feeling that and I'm just so overwhelmed. I'm also really frustrated with the client, the artist, that kind of stuff. And then that makes you feel so much better, where you're like, okay, I now understand where you're coming from and also where the problem lies. And then that way I was actually able to help navigate it more, or kind of being able to tweak what, like, my approach was, in, like, it was selling the same idea, but actually all you had to do was tweak the approach and make it feel like it was their idea, and like, get it across the line. Like,
I was going to say, I think there's a lot to be said about open, transparent communication and conversations on there in general. So let's talk about before you reach burnout, to how do you avoid burnout? Like, I always say, like, take your annual leave, but what happens if you feel like you can't because of the workload?
No, because me and you were saying this, but I always have trouble taking annual leave because I can never switch off, or there's something or another that requires your attention while you're off. And while might not be working the 9 till 6, I'm still constantly having to check emails, and I guess this is a personal preference, and obviously depends on the severity, or if there's enough cover like put in place for your work. But having that kind of, like, actual switch off, like, and we always encourage each other ourselves, and yet we've never managed to do it. But my advice would definitely be, when you take your annual leave, you take your annual leave, because I think that's when, like, there's just no boundaries anymore, and everything else. So I think you need to switch off, especially when you're paying for a vacation, or again, even if you took an annual leave just for a day off for whatever reason, like, you have taken that annual leave, take it.
Yeah, and I think that in a way it gets harder the more you go up in your career, because, as mid-level, like, I found it easier to switch off when I was an assistant in an exec position, because I was like, fuck it, somebody else was just up with the job. But then the more I've kind of climbed that ladder, you're like, well, there isn't anyone and I'm still needed for certain decisions. And I think it can be really difficult to resist that urge to be like, oh, maybe I should just be available. But you just need to for at least one of your annual leave. How it doesn't matter how long it is, it can be a day. I don't necessarily care, but for at least one section of your annual leave, you need to be like, I am unreachable. I am not going to check work. And you just need to have that willpower. And, also trying to finish work on time. I know without the commute and without the pressures of, managing house chores and work and everything else. And also staying at home. And I think COVID it's just had such a shift in people's mental health and well-being, because, for example, just to put in perspective, a week's worth of burnout, so just a week in which you're feeling burnout, which is probably the least level you're going to get, takes 22 weeks to recover from. Now put that in perspective. We've all been stuck at home with a variety of, mental, physical health issues. It's been a huge pandemic for a year and a half. Add burnout on top of that, you're probably talking a lot more than 22 weeks. So I think it's okay.
Yeah, how many weeks are in a year and a half?
Yeah, right, exactly. So I think it's
it'll take us 10 years to recover.
Like, it's easier to work late in the evening to try and get everything done, and once in a while this is okay, right? Like, there will always be a big deadline that you need to finish, and ahead of that deadline you just need to, and that is inevitably going to happen whether we want to or not, and that's not okay, but fine. You can accept that. But as a general rule, I really think there is a lot to be said about finishing work on time most days. And I found that, like, I needed to physically give myself something to do. So it would be that, as soon as I finish, I'm going to take a walk, or I'm going to, do some yoga. I'm going to start cooking. Like, it has to be an activity that's so different that it forces you to switch off. And it can be something as simple as, what, I'm going to finish, I'm going to take a shower, or I'm going to, as I said, start cooking. I'm going to read a book. I'm going to, I don't know, video game. I'm going to do whatever that activity is. Find one activity, and that's your switch off routine. And that can be changed as well. I'm not saying you have to do the same thing every day, because you might get bored. Or you might be someone that wants that routine, like similar to the commute. I think there's also a lot to be said about routine, but finishing the work on time. And I just, like, I feel like such an auntie when I say this, but it's that turn off your screen before you go to bed, go to sleep,
No, but because but being in lockdown has really blurred the lines and everything else. It's like, oh yeah, you either go from your living room to your bedroom. Like, it's not really much of a kind of like switch off, or as you said, it's like 5 steps, so it doesn't really feel like you moved very far. When you're working from home. So that's why you sometimes need that physical activity and that buffer, like that switch off, like whatever it may be. Like, yeah, as you said, if I'm spending an hour cooking, that's an hour that, like, yeah, I'm winding down, or taking on a task that actually requires my attention, that's personal rather than like work related at all, and then helps you kind of like find that little wall and separation and a way to close the door or close the screen like properly. So like, yeah, and again, for people to know you're offline as well.
Yeah, like, recovery from burnout takes a year to several years, so it's just ideal if you don't get to that point. When you have reached burnout, how have you coped with it? What have you done?
I mean, I probably wouldn't suggest like getting to my point of the road
Like,
in
I'm the
my kind
worst
of
person.
like
Like,
previous.
I physically didn't, because I was like, every time I've reached burnout, well, to be fair now, I think I've only reached burnout twice previously, like in previous jobs. And both times I've not dealt with it well, in that I've just left. I've just quit the job and I've just
Yeah, I
started
was.
somewhere new. And don't do that, and like don't take it to
Yeah.
our commitment phobia.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a company for a good 6 years, but I just got to a point of like complete burnout that literally I just couldn't see myself staying there. I physically couldn't. That was the thing. I was so checked out, and again, I was just so drained. I ended up like leaving the company and so what. And yeah, it's that thing where like I'm sure if there was something that could be done earlier down the road where I didn't really hit burnout, then that wouldn't have been the kind of like subsequent like result afterwards, but it kind of happened. And again, sometimes you need like to make big decisions for yourself where you take control of your narrative. That was the thing, like from when I first handed in my notice, it was all about actually just taking control of narrative, because as you said, you feel like, oh yeah, I'm not great at my job, I feel like an imposter and that kind of stuff, which was ridiculous because I've been in the job for 6 years. But it got to that point where like, oh, you're feeling that negative cycle all over again. So it was one way to snap out of it, and everything else. And yeah, needless to say, I did have those days where like I actually physically just couldn't go to work, and that is the actual like bad consequences of it. But you're just so not traumatized, but it does feel like, oh my God, I can't even physically bring myself to wake up for work or actually go into work, or log on or whatever it is. So
Yeah,
hitting that point is like not what I'd recommend. So
no, no,
just recognizing
definitely.
the signs earlier.
Definitely. And also recognizing the signs and acknowledging that, like, you know what, I am headed towards burnout, or I am at that point where I'm now burning out or burnt out. And I think recognizing the signs, acknowledging it, and being like, it's okay, like there's no shame in it. And then talk to your manager, your supervisor, your boss, whoever, and just because I think a lot of because it is relatively common, I think a lot of people, you'd be surprised at how supportive they probably will be and how much they can,
Mm.
sympathize with you. And if they don't, then we that's a different conversation about essentially a toxic workplace. But generally I think they probably would. And I think you just, once you reach that stage, you just need to take some time off, because the only way to properly recover
Mm.
is just to detach yourself from that environment for a little while, whether that could be a holiday, or whether that's just a couple of days, because whatever it is, it doesn't matter whether it's a week, it's a day, or 2 weeks. You do need to detach and allow yourself to just step back and refresh your mind a little bit.
Mm. Because again, you need recovery time, and everything else. And if you've already hit that point where, yeah, you just physically can't bring yourself to work, you're not good, no good to anyone. So at least if you can have a conversation with your manager, because again, I think when I had that conversation with my manager, she was like, I didn't realize you were feeling like that. And she was genuinely like, you should have told me earlier. I probably could have done something like moved some work around, or again looked for maybe some out of house, a freelancer or something to take on the work. But I was like, oh, unfortunately, at my point, I was a bit, it got a bit too late. And again, I just felt like, oh, I was a bit scared to be like, oh, I physically can't do the work anymore, like, or handle the work anymore. And would that hinder, like, and like, obviously, like, open a can of worms, and so on. And then, as well, our my previous one of my previous companies, actually looked at getting a subscription to like Mind or Unmind, and other kind of like various health apps that aren't necessarily about like diagnosing you or whatever it is, saying like you yeah, you're suffering from like anxiety, or suffering from panic attacks or anything like that, but just kind of like tips of like, oh yeah, if you're feeling overwhelmed, maybe there's an helping like breathing exercise, or there's certain things that kind of like help you, like certain like positive words that they show you, to kind of like keep reinforcing you over an app, which is quite nice. So I think like any kind of like things like that where you can kind of small little things that you can do to help cope through the day and just get some positive reinforcement and like help yourself like finish up your day, but on a bit more of a like help, like something that self-helps and helps you on self-care as well was quite good.
Yeah. I also think it's important to find your why. The like every time I've reached burnout, I've had to take some time off. Like I think you do just need to do that. But in that, I think you also need to find out the why this job, why this role, why this industry, or why this company. And we relearn to love those again. Because I think it's easy to get so stuck in the day to day. Like I've done it where I'm like, this project hasn't worked and that person did this and this happened and that happened. And then, I think about like, oh my God, I'm hating everything. But then I take a step back. I'm like, well, actually, I don't, because I love what I do. Do I want to change industry? No, I don't. Is it that a role thing? Is it a company thing? And really like honing in, what is it that's causing the burnout and what is it that's frustrating you right now, and then taking steps to change that. And that could be okay, well, I just need to change jobs, but also it could just be something as simple as, actually, I just need to manage my time in a way better. I just need to not say yes to stuff.
No, of course, because and as well, obviously it depends on the company and how much leeway and flexibility there is. But a couple of times when I've got to one of those serious conversations, my manager, well, one of my previous employers and manager did offer saying, well, how would you want to structure the role? Like, what's the absolute problem? Because rather than the company letting you go, like sort of thing, they might want to think about like just adjusting certain things. It might take some time, but again, as long as you kind of addressed it, kind of seen if there's a possibility, and again, like say in a positive light, it's not like yeah, you saying I can't do any projects. That's probably a bad conversation to have. But if it's just saying like, oh, there's just one or two projects too many, or again, I've got too many top tier clients and not enough smaller clients. It's a very big imbalance. It's just really hard to manage. Or again, there's too much projects on the US time, which is just causing my clock to go out of whack and things like that. Or again, if you're needing to work from home or do childcare or something like that, like, and it's just having that kind of 1 hour off to pick up my kids, but then I'm back online. Those kind of things that can be like actually could be feasibly arranged. Like it's a bit unorthodox, but again, it's not like that conversation can't be had. And again, like as long as you approach it diplomatically, it's a conversation. I'm not saying that your company will say yes, because it really depends on the situation. And again, my company said no, which like I ended up leaving for that reason. But like they were still open to having that conversation. And like seeing if there was a way to like move it forward and have a resolvement. So those kind of things, like maybe it's kind of like worth approaching. And again, it's more of a kind of like negotiation or a conversation. Might not happen, and it's not something that you can get in get on contract and everything else, but give it a go at least.
No, definitely. And I think it's interesting because it's so common, but not so common all at the same time. And it's like, I feel like
I think people don't
go on.
People don't openly people probably don't openly talk about it. I think I was really hesitant to ever talk about it in general. Being like, how do I admit that I didn't get up for work because I just physically couldn't, and things like that. It was such a hard conversation to kind of like say or admit to and things like that, because you kind of feel like, oh, I'm just really bad at managing my stress levels or emotions or whatever it is.
You do
So
blame
I think
yourself,
it's such a new conversation.
you do
Yeah, it's a very new
yourself.
conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you feel incompetent
So
at your job, and you just feel
yeah,
like, I
and
should be able
as
to handle
well,
this. Why aren't I? And if I tell my manager, are they going to think that I can't juggle my workload? And then if I can't juggle my workload, I'm never going to be taken to consideration for a promotion. And it just spirals this level. Like, it's just, anxiety about anxiety, and it's just not healthy, and it's so physically draining. And I think that's the thing, that burnout physically tires you out so much. And the example that I have is when you're really stressed or you're really overwhelmed and or have burnout, when you cry and you feel drained from crying, and you're like, imagine if I'm feeling this drained from crying, how drained must I have been to holding it all in? And I think that's the bit that we forget, because we need to release it. Like if you're feeling overwhelmed and you're stressed, you need to find a way to release it. Now, whether you want to scream into a pillow, whether you want to go for a run and physically exercise to get that stress out, or whether you just want to have a good old cry, a classic cry, it doesn't really matter. There's no shame in it. That's the thing. I think it's really important for people to remember that there is no shame in whatever you do to release that stress.
Yeah, because otherwise everything's just going to pent up, and then you're just going to start feeling like, oh, I've got a massive headache that's not gone for weeks, or my shoulders. Well, I've had this where like my shoulders literally have been in pain for a good 2 weeks, and I was like, there was no anything physical that made my shoulders hurt so much, but it's just pent up stress that psychiatrists have said, like it's literally when your body is like trying to warn you when you're just going through your low periods. And as you said, like everything starts knocking on and everything else, but it is your brain like starting to tell you that something is wrong, and things like start manifesting like physically onto you before it gets to your before you start getting the kind of like mental warning signs.
Definitely. It's crazy. Like if everybody is at that point where they're burnt out, switch off right now. Like forget about any, like I think it's so important to put yourself and put your health above anything else, which I think, unfortunately a lesson I learned way too late in life.
No, well, I made that decision. I decided to quit my job without having a job to go into, and that was you got to put yourself first though, because again, there's just no company in the world that is worth you slaving over like and dying for. So it's just that thing where it's you've got to prioritize yourself and look after yourself. If you find a way to cope in a company and you're perfectly happy, then absolutely fine. Like there's just going to be bad days, but when you just get to that point where you're just depleted, you've got no more mileage left in the car, so to speak, then you just know that like something's got to give. It's either you or the company. So which one will it be?
Yeah, definitely. Wow, this has been a good therapy session, I feel like, even though probably it's not what the podcast is for. However, probably should stop
but
my episodes as therapy.
I was like, maybe we should have given people better, a positive notes to take from these things.
No, I think we have. I think that there's a lot of things you could do to reduce it, what it kind of can feel like, even though it's so difficult because the signs are different for everybody, that point in which you realize the symptoms, it's going to be very different. Like, for example, this is not necessarily a burnout thing, but this is when I'm really stressed, and it's going to sound so stupid and so ridiculous, so caveat that, when I'm feeling really stressed, I get this very strong desire to put my hair in ponytails, like pigtails. And it's the most bizarre thing ever. Like I'll either do a pigtail all on one side, or it'll be two pigtails. And as soon as I have that urge, I'm like, yep, okay, I am so stressed. I am probably heading towards a burnout in a couple of months at the very most. I need to take a break. And that is my sign to like, okay, I need to take a break. Now, I'm not saying suddenly everybody's going to get the, urge to start wearing pigtails. And no offense to anyone that does wear pink at the moment, but
I
find
know. If it's
find those symptoms in you.
yeah, because you know yourself best, or at least like just need to kind of admit to yourself. Like if you're not comfortable in like owning up or admitting to anyone else, or possibly like at work if there's some restrictions and you can't really have that open conversation, um find a way to try and like cope with it first, because um people say that everyone has different coping mechanisms, like procrastination being quite like a classic one where actually it's just you coping, it's not you being lazy, it's just you being able to cope and deal with stuff. Or maybe you do the opposite, you get really OCD and want to clean, and that's you possibly trying to control your environment around you and things like that. So you've got your own telltale signs, and it's fine. Like it's actually normal. Everyone's probably got very similar ones, and probably you realize the person sitting next to you or your other colleague or your manager probably does the exact same thing. But they're just not sharing. Or again, it's that thing where it's like they probably don't notice that they're doing something out of like having their little outlet or little coping mechanism and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for joining on this therapy slash episode.
Yeah, and yeah, to all your listeners, like we'd love to hear the stories, or again, if you have like a great coping mechanism or something that's
Yes,
happened at work that
I want to hear burnout
like
stories.
caused you to rethink, or again notice that this is what you call burnout, then let us know.
Oh, Mikey, you made it till the end. I'm so happy. Well, listen, if you enjoyed what you heard and you want to hear more, subscribe to the podcast on, well, wherever you are listening to this. We are on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Deezer, TuneIn, Alexa, you name it, we're there. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on an episode. We also are on Instagram, which houses loads of behind the scenes audio snippets, polls, memes, and ways for you to get involved. So go follow us on Bold, Brown, and British. That's the handle. And until next time, keep safe, my wonderful samosas.